Good day to you. And isn't that a lovely cup of tea? Yeah, lovely. That's a very common way that British people use to describe drinking tea. And I'd like to ask you, are you a tea person or are you a coffee person? And more importantly, are you a tea or coffee person by choice or because you grew up in a culture that favors coffee, as the culture does for the most part in the United States, although things are changing and tea's becoming a little bit more popular? Or have you grown up in a place like Britain? Probably not, but as you know, my parents are British and tea is what they drink, and when they describe it, they use the word lovely. This is all part of the fabric of culture that surrounds us each and every day, and it influences the way that we dress, the colors that we have on, the way that we speak, the food that we ingest, and the media choices that we make. And so that's what this chapter is all about as we move now into chapter 4, cultural characteristics of media systems around the world. And culture is a really densely packed term. I mean, you've probably come across that term in some of your other classes, and it can mean things like popular culture, which is all about what people are consuming on a massive scale. And then there's culture from a sociological standpoint, which has to do with how we live our everyday lives. And then there's culture as I mean it in this book, which is how one set of people are distinguished from another set of people in terms of their media use. So that's the way that we look at culture in this particular chapter. And referring back now to the tree metaphor, which I'll do throughout this course, culture is like the soil that surrounds a tree. All of the nutrients that go into the roots of the tree come from the soil. And if you've ever had a fancy, there's another English word, if you ever had a fancy to plant flowers and look at how those flowers do in different locations in your yard, you know that if you move one plant that flowers to a completely different location, the color may change on the flower. And that's because the nutrients in the soil are quite different. So I use that parallel, that metaphorical parallel, to describe how media systems can also differ by the culture that they grow up in. And so we're going to take a look at some of the cultural characteristics of the 8 countries that are in this book, in this chapter. And we'll start out with France. And France is really interesting because of its geography. Because it's a big country in Europe. It's the second largest country in Europe. By the way, if you see me looking here, I'm looking at my notes over here to the side. I'm coming to you from my kitchen today, by the way. But at any rate, France is the second biggest country in Europe, and yet it's surrounded by a ton of other countries. It's surrounded by Belgium and Holland. It's got England across the Channel. It's got Germany. It's got Spain. So it has all of these countries surrounding it with different languages and also different heritages to it. It makes it very interesting. Now, one of the things that is a strong point of French culture is the language. You know, French as a language, if you speak it, and I know some of you in this class do or have at least had it, French as a language is not just about communicating your thoughts, it's about performing. And when you see 2 French people speaking, they're often waving their arms wildly and really speaking with inflection and big rises in pitch and bottoms in pitch. And that's because French as a medium of expression is a performance to the French. Also, French used to be the world's language. Back when Napoleon's fleet was controlling most of the world, the French language was spread all over the place, to Montreal and even here in New Orleans in our own country. And so the French are a little bit, well, how can we say, regretful that their language is no longer the language of choice around the world. We know that English is spoken in more places, and especially is used more in the context of media content. But French as a language is something that the French, they regret a little bit, and it influences their media system because they actually put restrictions on how much foreign language content can be imported into France. We'll talk more about that under regulation. Also in France, you have a government system that is very strong national government. Everything goes through Paris, as they say. Very different from our system, where in Washington sometimes is at odds with our state governments, like a Pennsylvania state government. In France, everything goes through the national government. In part, that's because it was run over twice by Germany in world wars, and they want France to remain strong. So France has those characteristics to it, and I want you to, as you read this chapter and consider the material in my lecture, think about later on how these characteristics play out in terms of media systems, media content, and other dimensions, other elements of media that we're talking about. Moving on now to Sweden. Though Sweden is a very, very unusual and special country. I've spent a lot of time in Sweden. It's a Scandinavian country along with Denmark and Norway and Iceland, and some people consider Finland to be a Scandinavian country as well. It's a country that only has 9 million people though, so it's a very, very tiny country population-wise. And that means that the average Swede, if they want to have a kind of a future that is beyond Sweden to them, they have to learn another language. So if you stop and ask an average Swedish person on the street, doesn't matter if they're a grandmother or a child, a question in English, they can answer it. And one of the ways that they do that is they use television. You'll see in my book, they use television to actually teach the English language by playing back a movie or a sitcom or a drama from another country, but playing it back in the native English language, that's what the audio is, and then a black bar at the bottom of the television gives the Swedish. So they're using television as an educational tool in that way, and there's a photograph of that in my book. In Sweden, you have a lot of connection with Finnish people. If you check out the map that's in the book, that would be very helpful to you, or Google a map and bring it up on your computer as you're watching this video. You'll see how close Finland is. And they have a lot of Finnish people who are living in Sweden. And Finns, by the way, speak a completely different language. The only language that's similar to Finland is found in Hungary. And so you have a big population in your country, and that plays out in terms of Sweden serving Finnish speakers with radio programming. The government providing that radio programming to educate and to entertain Finnish speakers within Sweden. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Another hallmark of Sweden, which is a little bit similar to France, is it's a very, very open society based mainly on considerations of nature. Now, what I mean by that is there is no subject that is off limits for a Swede. You can speak about the deepest sex talk with Swedes. You can speak about politics, religion. You can ask a Swedish person, what do you think of this meal that I just made? And they might respond, instead of trying to be nice and courteous, if they're a guest in your home, they may say, well, it's a little too salty for my taste. And just say it very matter-of-factly like that, because they're very, very open. Now, what they have in common with France is an openness towards the human body as well. And that's why we see a lot of nudity in Swedish television. We see a lot of nudity in French television as well. France has more of a view of nudity as being an example of beauty. The human body is beautiful. Whereas Sweden, it's more about, it's natural. We're born into the world naked. We take showers naked. And so when they go to the beach, Swedes, they will change right on the beach. They're not embarrassed at all about their bodies. And it's not a gawking thing. It's just natural. And that's why they use the saunas so much. They jump in a sauna. A whole group of people sit in a sauna naked, and then they go dive into a lake. It's all about, getting a little bit detailed here, but it's all about opening up the pores and then closing them down to cleanse yourself, and that's Swedish lifestyle. All right, moving on now to the next country that we're going to talk about. It's going to be the UK. The UK is a country that actually is named, at least one of its countries. The United Kingdom has England, and England is the name of our language, the English language. It makes it unusual in and of itself, but also the UK is an island. And if you've ever been in an island, you know that there's an island mentality, that you do feel different and separate and in some ways vulnerable than other countries that are more landlocked. And so in the case of England, or the UK, I should say, you have a country that does not necessarily consider itself to be European. In some ways, the UK considers itself to be closer to the United States in terms of some of its values and tastes, and certainly in terms of the language. In the United Kingdom, you have people who, generally speaking, are big readers. And because they're big readers, not reading, entertainment magazines necessarily, or reading web pages, they're reading books. And I don't mean English literature necessarily, I just mean books. The Brits are always reading books, and you can see a photograph of that in my book as well. You can see people reading newspapers on a train. many more than you would find on an American train or a Canadian train. Because they read so much, they like to have a lot of, well, I'll call them intellectual discussions, but that's really making it a little bit too condescending. Let's just say they have informed discussions. I'll never forget the time that I took a taxi to the airport in the UK, and the taxi driver knew so much more about the Civil War here in the United States than I did. And he's saying things like, Ulysses Grant and the Confederate general escapes my name right now, but those two, they were actually great friends, weren't they? The Union general and the Confederate general, Robert E. Lee, weren't they? And I'm saying, yeah, they're really good friends. That's the kind of things that the average English person knows because they're reading a lot, and also because they're watching television content that provides that information, but more about that later. Moving on to the United States is a big country, but surprisingly, it only touches two other countries, Canada and Mexico, making it somewhat difficult for people to travel and be exposed to other countries. So it's a big country, but it's very, very isolated at the same time. It also is a country that is very, very practical, the United States. So we pride ourselves on not getting too fancy, not getting too ornate. We just like things to work in the United States. And sometimes we sacrifice aesthetics just so that they work. I'm not going to spend much more time on the U.S. because you're a U.S. person, well, most of you are, and you already know a lot about our culture as it is. Moving to Mexico now. Mexico is the 8th largest country in the world. Surprisingly, compared to other countries, it used to have a colonial power that invaded it and set up its current government. Mexico has a very distant relationship with Spain. There's hardly any connection with Spain at all in Mexico. So that's one thing that makes it different, meaning that it doesn't receive a lot of content from Spain in the media. Whereas a place like Quebec, Canada, or a place like Martinique, an island in the Caribbean, they receive a ton of French content from France because they have a close connection with that mother country. But in Mexico, not so much. A lot of people living in poverty in Mexico, 40% of people living in poverty. I've been through many towns in Mexico where the sewer water is still running through the streets. But this doesn't describe all of Mexico. It certainly doesn't even describe most of Mexico. Most of Mexico is very modern, in many ways more modernized than the United States, certainly in terms of its roads and its bus system. But you do have a strong poverty rate in Mexico, and a lot of the poverty, unfortunately, is amongst children as well. Mexico is strongly Roman Catholic. It's said that Mexico is more Catholic than Rome. And everywhere you go, you see Our Lady of Guadalupe. I don't think she's a saint, but she's the main religious figure in Mexico, and you can see her hanging in medallions from bus drivers' windows, and you see shops that are selling religious artifacts. Our Lady of Guadalupe, and Catholicism is very present in the average Mexican's life. Also, we should mention that the Mexican government is a relatively new government. Since the year 2000, the Mexican elections have been somewhat free. For about 71 years before the year 2000, there was a lot of corruption, a lot of parties the party that was in power, the PRI, was guaranteed to be in power for 71 years. So it's a kind of a relatively new democracy right there in Mexico. Moving to China now. China is the 4th largest country in the world. Just past the United States, by the way, is the world's largest economy. And that just happened last year. That's pretty amazing. China is a very, very old civilization. It's an ancient civilization. You see a lot of practices in Chinese culture. For example, alternative medicine or natural medicine or Eastern medicine or holistic medicine, however you want to talk about it. That is based on centuries and centuries of knowledge about herbs and knowledge about body positions and knowledge about spirituality and knowledge about, just knowledge from ancient history. That's what you see when you're in China. In China, there are so many people, 1.5 billion or somewhere around there, that it makes literacy very, very difficult. Think about that, trying to get literacy among your own nation. We take it for granted that everybody speaks English, but in China, there have been a lot of languages that have competed with each other to become the national language. And one of the reasons that languages have had a hard time, Mandarin eventually became the most predominant Chinese language, but one of the reasons is because the Chinese alphabet is 10,000 characters. 10,000 characters. The average Chinese citizen spends a lifetime trying to learn the language because of the amount of characters. We only have, what, 20, is it 26 in the English language? Can you imagine memorizing 10,000 in China? And so it's made building a language, a national language, a very, very difficult thing to do. Of course, China, we know as a communist country or a socialist country, not that they are the same, they're very, very different. It depends on maybe your analysis of which one you consider it to be, but at the very least it's a socialist. No, it's really a communist country because it has a single party, because all other parties are considered to be invalid. Now, does that mean that it's a country that is oppressive in every single way? Well, a lot of oppression is in China. There's a lot of censorship. You can't post freely on the internet any criticism of the government, but there's a lot of freedoms that Chinese have that we don't have. Freedom away from crime. For example, try walking in Central Park in New York City at 2 a.m. and feeling safe. Are you going to? I don't think so. In China, you can do that. So I'm just throwing out a devil's advocate view to make sure that we don't automatically write off other countries just because their system is very, very different from ours. Moving now to Ghana. Ghana, like Mexico, is a relatively new country in terms of having a government in place that's a semi-free government, also around the year 2000. And prior to that, Ghana suffered from a lot of military dictatorships. If you had a radio show, oftentimes you would have a military officer or a military, how can I say, a military person sitting in the studio with you. No words spoken. It's just that if you're going to say something against the government, you might be taken away by this military person and not heard of after that. And so that's the kind of legacy that Ghana lived with for many, many years. And also Ghana was part of what might be considered the original globalization. It was part of, unfortunately, the slave trade. The triangle of globalization that existed for the slave trade was originally Ghana was a country that was where gold was discovered, and the Portuguese mined a lot of gold out of Ghana. In fact, the original name for it was Gold Coast. But after that, when that supply waned, then Ghana, like a lot of other West African and other countries, became a source of slaves, which were unloaded to British ships, Dutch ships, Portuguese ships, taken to the Caribbean. This is where the triangle comes in. Taken to the Caribbean, where they were offloaded, and then went to work on plantations. And then what was unloaded onto the ships was the products from those plantations, which would be coffee and sugar and molasses and rum. And then those goods were taken to Europe, where the whole process would start all over again. So that's the triangle of globalization, the original globalization. Ghana was a very big part of it. Ghana has as its first language today English because of British occupation and colonialization of Ghana. And if you go to Ghana, that's what most people are speaking, but they have a lot of people also who are speaking tribal languages, and many of these tribal languages have no written form. So right away, you can't have a newspaper for these tribes. There's no written form. They are only oral languages, which means that those tribes favor radio over newspapers and other printed media because radio is an oral medium. Coming to Lebanon now, our final country. Lebanon has had just a very long history of warfare and conflict. It's right there. It's the welcome mat to the Far East. If you go across the Mediterranean and you want to go to Saudi Arabia, India, China, you got to go through Lebanon. It's a tiny country. It's only like 28 miles wide. And so you can get from one side to the other in like 45 minutes. But because it's had a lot of occupation, the Brits were there, the Ottoman Turks were there, the French were there. There's a lot of influences of foreign countries, foreign powers still in Lebanon. And since it's such a tiny country with no big oil resources, it doesn't really have the wealth or the power or the scale to be able to assert a lot of its autonomy. So later on, we'll find out that actually you have a British radio station located inside of Lebanon, the BBC. I'm not talking about programming going into Lebanon. I'm talking about an actual radio station. Do we have a foreign radio station in our country? No, we do not. So Lebanon has a very weak central government, which means when it comes to media, there are rules on the books, but they don't necessarily have the power and the authority to enforce those rules. Interestingly enough, although Arabic is the first language, if you want to have status in Lebanon, you speak French. So it's not looked at as a relic of the past of colonialization that they would like to pretend doesn't exist or get rid of. They actually embrace French culture and the things that French people stand for as part of the Lebanese higher standard of living today. So there you have it. There's the soil that surrounds the media systems of these 8 countries. And as we go forward in this book and start to look at the other elements, we will start to hopefully recall some of these things that we talked about today and know that the media forms that we're seeing in those countries are directly related to those cultural characteristics. Have a great day and have a lovely cup of tea. Or maybe this, since you're American.